Chapter 7. Slow Dance. The awakened, the so-called monastic orders, are always and will always be an enemy of church, government, and man. They have been given the keys to their own souls, but none of the wisdom to make alterations that are sensible. They are forever destined to be juvenile godlings, and that immaturity dooms any attempts that they make towards a stable relationship with the rest of humanity. I say be done with them, and yet I know that my words fall on deaf ears. Ever the needs of the moment will trump the good sense of forever. Brother Captain Pavel Orlichenko, 42. Theses.
I started slightly as the reticular inhibitor disengaged, and I popped back into a different reality. Sweat had beaded on my forehead and soaked my blouse. The long muscles of my neck and back were tense, and a throbbing headache was already roaring in over the horizon. That had been significantly less fun than my usual trips into the virtual world. Though technically, the Star Chamber was a real place, and I had been dive-casting in. I looked around and took in the greying coffee-stained walls of the 11th District. Inspector Griever from Vice had loaned me her dive rig. It was located in the filthy hole that was her cubicle, and when my nose had wrinkled with disgust, the woman had made a pathetic show of wiping the musty and bio-contaminated recliner that occupied her station. It hadn't been my first choice, but the 11th was the closest to the crime scene, and to dive into the Star Chamber you needed a secured line. I would have preferred to have gotten to my own rig in the Alefecture, where Central CID was located, but excluding another jumper hop. There was no way I was going to beat a 3-block jog for time. I would have relished another ride with Koroleth, but Aloshia, our dispatched daemon, had nixed the request outright. Instead, I had left Germaine and Deacon Sarah to continue the work of scouring the crime scene and badgering witnesses, and had run to make myself available to the Star Chamber. Even before my arrival, the urgency of my mission had been made clear to the brass of the 11th, so I found Griever's equipment all laid out for me as I burst sweating through the door 20 minutes ago. Now the entirety of the 11th District was oh so casually going about their business in such a way as to not make it completely obvious that they were looking for me to let something slip as to the nature of my business. I ignored them and kept my head high and eyes straight. I was under internal investigation. I wasn't going to give the spooks a single fucking inch. I gave my thanks to Griever and kept things moving. She tried to offer me coffee, but I waved her off, and something about the pull on my face must have dissuaded her from pushing the issue. I had far too many appointments to keep. My grid terminal was alight with various communiques. About half of them were updates from CS Ingrid and Rommel on this or that discovery from the scene of the crime, or the recovered video footage. The other half were demands for updates and contact information from the plethora of now involved parties. Davida Chalmers from Revenue had laughed off my threats from yesterday morning. She had responded to my demands for fiscal statements on Damien Faulkner with a terse set of phrases that effectively boiled down to fuck off. Only thing was that just moments ago, she had sent me another message. This one was an obsequious apology and full compliance with my demands. If you read between the lines, it was obvious someone large had stepped on her throat. All 3 of the goons that the mayoralty had assigned to me had forwarded their contacts along with messages of varying pushiness demanding an immediate meetup. They were unfortunately a high priority. Political goodwill was going to be one of the more important resources when it came to solving this fiasco. I had Nivash reach out and scheduled an ASAP. If I could manage it, My strategy would be to do a quick meet and greet with all of them, to test the waters, and then isolate them to figure out what the hidden agendas were. Germain had left me a quick sending to let me know that the bodies were already on their way to the Joseph Central Morgue, and that he had greatly enjoyed doing my job for me while I gave the brass a handjob. He had included an enormous checklist that showed all the names that still needed to be interviewed, along with a helpful annotated map. There was a simple automated message from Trinity herself that provided me with 3 communication protocols with their associated handshakes. Each code had a label attached. The first read Dragonslayer 6 Operational Planning. The second code was named Scramble Rapid Response, and the final code simply read Samil. That one gave me chills. Fulvius Judah wasn't playing around. Apparently, the legend himself, Samuel the Hunter, was on my back should I so require it. Finally, last among the relevant messages, there were the reporters. It seemed that the blackout was still intact, but the most cunning of the vile dogs was sniffing around the edges of the truth. They were smart enough, I supposed. They knew that a PsychoCIDE investigation was active, and the snake Jean-Paul Baptiste had even managed to figure out that Damien Faulkner was a victim. The full gravity of the situation still eluded them. At least that was what their communiques told me. The 11th district was set underneath one of the 4 major railway lines that traversed the length of Joseph Habitat. The entire area was done up in Gothic colonnades and living sculpture. Gargoyles of intricate beauty and ugliness posed in slow dance shifted subtly over time to form new and interesting configurations. A pair that appeared to be chimera of hog, lion and snake formed the entry archway to the 11th and were eternally coiled about one another in a mortal struggle. The form of their battle shifted, as did their appearance, but always they framed the 11th with their combat. Normally, I would have paused and enjoyed the vision, but I was not in the mood. I could almost feel the weight crushing me. The case, the spooks, my newly acquired gaggle of human irritations and impediments, and the fact that I was going to start slipping off the leaderboards if I didn't find some time to log on to the Black Force server. On top of all that, for no reason, I could discern I had acquired a dull ache in my arm that beat a tempo of more discomfort to come. I needed to keep busy. I walked as I worked, keeping half a mind on avoiding obstacles while dictating to Nervash this and that. I could at least knock off some of the lists that Germain had sent me while I moved. I had Nervash dig up profile information on various low-hanging fruit. I went for those who had abnormally high scores in civics, morality and piety. Let Nervash dig up some basic information on them and then send them tailored messages designed to tug at the appropriate heartstrings. It varies person to person. For Alonso Dugan, who lived 4 floors down from victim A, it was duty. The city requires your service. For Melania Setkova, it was compassion. Please help me. Each person was a tiny puzzle, and with the information that was at my fingertips, it was easy to craft unique poisons. The number 1 question that I got from other Black Force players when they found out I was a Trinity Metro cop was about privacy. The stories about our surveillance state stretched from the mercurial orbit out past the Proxima Centauri and to the colonies in the deep. Some of it was true. We did know what color your shit was. That was highly relevant public health information. However, the major difference between the whispered and legendary omnipresence of TMC and the sad actuality was the difference between a little girl's dreams of owning a pony and the actual breathing stinking reality of horse ownership. People are not docile. Indeed, they are malcontent by design. It was a fight to get everything. They lied, they dissembled, and they threw up false trails out of sheer contrariness. For us, the problem wasn't knowing things. It was trusting what we knew. And worse, figuring out that you even knew what you knew. I might have a record of how many hairs you have on your left hand, but that piece of information is buried in a mountain of 1 billion factoids, and who is to say that it will matter or not? There was an entire cottage industry of men, women, and intelligences who made it their business to sift through information and construct valid and useful profiles on others. Those that could pay would then have access to this treasure trove. See, here on Trinity, the danger was not the police, it was your neighbors. The only difference between me and a random stranger was my access to George, and that the constabulary paid my subscription fee to WebTracker, Kaleidos, Reputron, and Face Invader. I was working through an aggregate report on one Linda Bell Tellurian trying to square the circle between her high church-provided piety score and her low morality index on Reputron when a high-priority message popped onto my deck. I immediately paged over from my work as I sidestepped a cluster of wealthy goodwives gabbing in the middle of the walkway. Right away, I knew that there was something wrong with this missive. There was no sender, which should have not been possible. According to Nirvash, the electronic communique had popped out of the ether and into my inbox. What's more, I could count on one hand the number of people who had the right or ability to send me priority messages. See you soon. That was everything the message contained. There was no signature. That was more than ominous. It was disastrous. The lack of a pedigree indicated sorcery of one manner or another. Anytime something impossible happened, some form of subspace to real space contamination was the go-to culprit. My mind started shuffling through the possibilities. There were too many parties to blame. Anyone ordained to the church and Buxom and with the proper relic could invoke one of the cherubim to bend reality just so, and bypass most any mundane restrictions. Any monastic who had invested themselves properly could duplicate the feat, and who knows what sorts of dreamware existed that could manage the task. All the supernal arts disturbed me. They were dangerous in so many different ways that it was difficult to enumerate all the possible disasters that could come from their involvement. Warding around the Ark usually prevented the casual uses of unauthorized sorcery. And as for the professional miscreant, the church was quite proactive about that. Sweat was beginning to bead on the back of my neck. I had no love of anything supernal. No one could find themselves subjected to malevolent reality bending and not retain a healthy terror of the practice. All around me, the gargoyles and the buildings they decorated seemed to loom closer. I could feel their eyes boring into me, and the whole world suddenly seemed sharper and more claustrophobic. There was this one statue that seemed almost human, whose face was twisted in fear that seemed to mirror my own feelings precisely. This case was too broad. There were too many leads, too many interested parties, too many options. The breadth of possibility was now yawning open to an infinite width, and with the introduction of sorcery, that more now had sharp teeth. The world jarred, and I found myself staring bewildered at the curving inverted city sky. I wasn't harmed, but I was stunned. I instantly staggered to my feet in a rough defensive stance, looking for the danger. My eyes cast around, and I quickly realized that the culprit was me. It appeared I had been so lost in my thoughts and distracted that I had ran headlong into a little boy who had abruptly halted in the middle of the walkway to gaze at the gargoyles decorating the exterior of an upscale patisserie. No, that wasn't quite right. I shook my head and re-evaluated. The little boy was not a boy at all. It was a young woman if the silhouette could be trusted, and she was scandalously undressed. She wore a boy's pants that barely concealed her curves and had seemingly neglected a blouse altogether. Her jacket was that of a well-to-do gentleman, high-collared, buttoned only once, so that there was almost nothing of her modest décolletage left to the imagination. And her belly button was winking its indecency at the world. Her hair was rough and mannish, inappropriately short, and topped with a teeny tiny hat that could only have been held in place with artifice of some sort. She stood with an easy self-absorbed posture, a deformed swagger stick on one shoulder at a jaunty angle. She grinned in an entirely too self-confident manner as she saw my flushed cheeks and shocked expression. She half swaggered and half swayed towards me and gave me a dramatic and exaggerated bow.
Ezra Talltower, at your service.
She had a squeaky voice and was freckled like a teenage bumpkin from the far colonies, but I now saw her for what she was. Ezra St. Garrett, I presume. I tried not to spit the words, but I failed utterly. The monk's grin only widened, and her eyes, great green things, flashed with mirth and malice.
The one and only. Your knight-errant, your paladin protector, and your dashing champion.
Ezra popped out of her bow with a twirling flourish and settled back, half leaning, half sitting, braced against her twisted white swagger stick.
Promised and delivered. Foretold and fulfilled. Expected and arrived.
Things suddenly made a lot of sense. I am dense and powerful, so much so that when I run into people they end up on the ground, and I am often not even staggered. To bounce me flat on my ass requires you to be unnaturally weighty, heavily augmented, or not really in sync with reality. I had a fair bet that Ezra was going to be at 3 for 3 on those counts. Monks of the Order St. Garrett were shapeshifters. Their form flowed and compressed like clay and wire in the hands of a sculptor. I was uncertain and in no small way repulsed. Worse, I was certain that my body language was screaming just that. The gifts of the orders were manifold, and quite a few played with the human form, changing it hither and thither. That didn't mean I enjoyed it at all. It made them seem monstrous and deceptive to me, and there was little rationality to the feeling. I couldn't shake the worry about what lurked below this slip's skin. Ezra seemed inured to my opinion, much as she was immune to the constant starts and stares that she attracted from passers-by. In fact, she seemed positively delighted by the scandalized populace. She was lucky that no good wife had taken a more acute offense to her improper state, though I suppose that really the luck ran both ways. Monks weren't just immune to the laws of fashion and propriety. Tatsuki McLauglin, Deacon Inspector Master Grade, PsychoCIDE. I extended a hand and swallowed my feelings. The monk grinned like a cat and grasped my proffered hand with a bone-crushing grip. It started as painful, but when I squeezed back, the phrase bone-crushing became far more literal. If I had standard-issue human bones, they would have literally cracked. As it was, that hand was a painful vice that I instinctively strained to counter. Part of me was thrilled. This was the perfect solution to all of this uncertainty. A savage glee that I was being directly challenged with full permission to fight back. I peeled back my lips and bared my teeth in something that in poor light might have been mistaken for a smile. My musculature swelled and my internal reactor powered into higher gear. My flesh rippled and ticked, hidden under my sleeves, and my hand contracted with force to match the grinning monk. There we stood, locked in struggle, each refusing to budge. My heart was pounding and my hand was on fire, but what was worse was that Ezra St. Garrett didn't seem to be sharing my exertion and pain. She stood there relaxed and cocky, easily matching my force. A sliver of something dark danced behind her eyes, and I could almost feel the false conciliation and gloating that was soon to come. It was agony. Red wires of burning pain crawled through my muscles, mixed with sharp silver nails hammered into my bones. There was a black serpent with its coils wrapped around my chest. The world was getting faint, and a rushing noise was filling my ears. My vision was narrowing to a single point, and I could feel the tiny pops of little things breaking in my hand. Why are you doing this? My will was failing and I was falling into the darkness when the question came to me unbidden, and a small ugly bridal thing whispered back. No one is better than me. I stood before a great brass door, and on the other side I heard the riot of battle. I reached forward and I could feel the heat of hell's furnaces radiating off its hinges. My hand touched the searing surface, and with the suddenness of a light coming on, the world popped back into focus. Ezra St. Garrett had released my hand and taken a full step backwards. Her smile was still there, but it was no longer mocking but nervous. I looked down and was surprised to see my hand still attached to my arm. It was purple, bleeding, cracked and twisted, but it was still there. I brought my hand slowly to my chest, trying to blink away my confusion and pain. I had a few missing seconds, and I realized the monk was cradling her own hand, which was red and swollen. My heart almost stopped. A quick inventory showed that all my seals were in place. A Nervash reported a complete barrier integrity on the locks surrounding my inferno system. The relief that washed through me was so complete as to banish even the agony of my hand. I started laughing, a small chuckle, and before I knew it, the monk had joined me in giggling. It was a rueful moment. We met eyes, and there was a realization how close to the edge things had gotten. We stood there, 2 paces apart in the heart of civilization, with the evening rush flowing around us, and were completely alone. She was the one to break the moment.
You are not what I expected.
She spread her hands in a tiny mea culpa.
I think we will get along quite well, though. It is rare I find a civil servant interesting.
The pause was subtle, but the meaning was clear to me. I had almost crossed a line, and Ezra Talltower had felt it.
Come,
She said as she proffered an arm.
we should walk and talk. I saw Radamon's a few blocks down. We can get your hand looked after. My treat.
I nodded and let her lead me down the road. I hid my mangled hand in my overcoat and did my best not to let the pain overwhelm me. Dad had not included a pain override in my limbic system when he designed me, and he had refused to allow me to get one when I grew older. When I had gone complaining to Mum, she had told me off quite severely.
To live is to suffer. Pain is what makes you human.
She had then struck me across my cheek. A precise blow that was just hard enough to draw her nails through my skin and splash my blood upon the floor. A punishment for attempting to go behind my father's back, and a lesson to be learned, she explained as she had cleaned the burning cut. Despite the promise to walk and talk, the trip was a hurried and silent one. Ezra didn't say so much as a word as she bundled me through the clear door of the upscale medical cybernetics parlor. Only the best for the elite of Ashfall. The whole place was done up in dark woods, alabaster and gold, and the gaggle of androids who served as the staff were all late-model Technodyne shivers. Artful, multi-armed and intricately tooled with gems and precious metals. The effect was that the clinic felt like a beautiful temple to pagan gods. I stood rigid in the sanctum, my hand throbbing, while Ezra talked to the manager. The middle-aged man was a picture of elegance in service and had been winding up to kick us out on the curb when Ezra had tapped him on the chest with her swagger stick and gave him a direct look in the eye. He went white as a sheet and had suddenly been all bows and courtesies as he ushered us into the largest suite. I was shaky and turning whiter than a ghost, but despite my obvious agony, the attendant shivers were acutely formal as they made their apologies and asked permission before carefully and smoothly removing my overcoat and blouse, leaving me with only my brassiere. They shuffled me into a reclining chair that sat in the center of the operating theatre, and after a quick permission exchange with Nervash, wordlessly began to work, injecting me with painkillers and spraying disinfectants on my arm. I gasped in relief as the pain winked out between breaths. Ezra, for her part, stalked after me and pulled up a seat on a tiny stool. It was very rude to intrude on someone while they were being operated on, but no one seemed to have the will to gainsay the tiny monk. The manager had appropriately excused himself before I had been undressed, but hadn't even attempted to ask Ezra to leave. She rested her chin in her hands and stared at me for a long moment before speaking. There was an openness and a discomforting lasciviousness to her gaze as she looked me over, part by part. I felt my heart start up, thudding behind my breast as she peeled back the layers of my modesty. Finally, she seemed satisfied and locked her gaze on my eyes. Immense relief flooded me, and the tiny raw thing in my chest receded.
Tell me about my opposition.
My eyes flickered from hers and saw the shivers peeling back my skin with fine scalpels. I started. I hadn't even felt them start the procedure. Custom nanosite nerve blockers had their advantages, it seemed. 3 major possibilities if it is local. I tried to speak evenly, keeping my eyes off the work of the surgeon androids as they reconstructed, bound, and stitched the damage. My number 1 is always going to be Belinda Lockstam. She is a cold sociopath who has been hitting professionally for at least the past 7 or so years. Nominally, she is of the Order of St. Cushing, but they disavowed her about 15 years ago. She hasn't been excommunicated or even expelled, but they have basically taken an entirely hands-off approach to her misbehavior. We have questioned her in connection to every PsychoCIDE in the last 5 years, but we only have about a quarter of them pegged as her work for sure. We haven't been able to get enough evidence to indict, much less convict. Still, when she gets away with it, she sends us a bouquet of flowers when the case is closed.
St. Cushing is going to be a bit of a bitch, but she seems like she is going to be an arrogant sociopath.
Ezra rolled her shoulders and grimaced.
I can exploit that if push comes to shove. Who does she work for?
Freelancer as far as we can tell. She does more jobs for the Rose than for anyone else, but that is more a result of the fact of they have more money and more enemies.
They said you had 3 likelies. Who are the other 2?
Shinnon St. Teusa Ni Williams is the major asset of the consortium. He doesn't do much work and spends most of his time being a vague threat. But on occasion, you will have a slew of PsychoCIDEs that serve consortium interests. He doesn't mock like good old Bella. He is a quiet meticulous and a perfectionist. We still haven't managed to come close to proving he is behind any of these PsychoCIDEs. Ezra's freckled face screwed up into a confused smirk.
If you have no evidence, how can you assume that he is the hitter?
I sighed and shrugged back at her. He is labelled as an outside consultant on the consortium financial statements, but he does no work we can see and is paid lavishly for it. Also, his presence here on the Ark coincides with the killings, even though we cannot pin anything more specific on him. Ezra sniffed and gave a non-committal grunt.
Sounds thin, but if you're right, then he is screwed. Never met a lynx who I couldn't fuck utterly.
She leered at me as she spoke, daring me to call her on her vulgarity. As I viewed her expression, there was an almost clinical detachment. Maybe it was a side effect of the nerve blockers that the shivers were pumping into me. But I felt strangely immune to her provocation. Not that vulgarity would have had any effect anyway. The monk was quite ignorant of cop culture. My blank face seemed to aggravate Ezra, and she gave a huff before continuing.
Anyways, I am not familiar with your local politics. Who is this consortium? Some sort of crime syndicate like the Rose?
It was my turn to smirk. This level of ignorance was stunning. Still, I supposed that if anyone could afford to be ignorant of the world, it was a monastic. First, the Rose is not a crime syndicate in the traditional sense. It's a cult that finances itself with crime. Second, the consortium is not a crime syndicate. It's a consortium. The Trinity Independent Business Consortium. It's a loose alliance of the unsanctified business interests in Trinity. They mostly do political lobbying and the like, but they aren't above crooked means to accomplish their ends.
Shinhan Williams being their most crooked means?
Ezra posed the question with a grin. I almost laughed myself, but not at the so-so wit of the monk. Ezra seemed to have a smile for every occasion. I found myself wondering just how many smiles this little cat had. There was a small sinking in my stomach, as I imagined what her smile looked like when she killed. One was not recommended as a premier manhunter, lest one hunted men. My eyes went back to the androids, and I saw my hand laid, open and bloody. The Shavas were welding new Armostion matrix onto my bones, even as their other fingers fished broken fragments out of the meat. I tried to do a quick back-of-the-envelope calculation on the cost of this procedure, and then stopped myself. This wouldn't have been too expensive if my bones were made of bone. But the custom jobs were never ever cheap. I didn't want to know how much the irritating girl was blowing on a whim. It would just make me angry. Yes, I said, that's the assumption.
What about the last one?
Roland Marcuse is tonsured to the Order of St. Albrecht, and is the only one of the three that I have ever gotten close to. He works for the Admiralty, an informal organization that operates as a mediator between all the pirates and smugglers that call Esther their home. Roland is a heavy hitter, and is often sent to make examples of those that step too far out of line. We have solid proof that he has murdered people out in the deep. Unaligned traders and vagabonds, never anyone of the faith. So, the magisterium has never pressured the conclave to prosecute a kill order. That being said, we are really quite certain that he is killing Christians too. Marcuse is just more careful when he runs the risk of getting excommed. The new smile on Ezra St. Garrett was a one and Richter's thing.
Fuck, I hope he isn't the one. A puddle jumper who can perform the black transformation. That's not a thrilling challenge. It's a recipe for disaster and buggery.
The reference sailed over my head, so I gave the tiny monk a confused expression and asked, "Puddle jumper?" She looked away for a moment.
Shop talk just means that he can operate in the literal domain, between low planetary orbit and local planetary objects. Earth to moon stuff.
I take it that this is a bad thing? Ezra nodded, with what I could only describe as a queasy grin.
Monks of different orders have different specialties, but that doesn't mean that we are born equal or that some specialties aren't much more dangerous than others.
There was a little pause, and for a blessed moment the monk stopped smiling. Instead, she seemed internally focused.
Keep a secret?
I nodded in assent.
We don't like spreading it around, but internally we classify the orders by scope. Some orders are called first circle. Those are the ones whose powers extend only to themselves or within arm's reach. Then next, you have orders where their powers are great enough that they operate in a wide radius, enough to affect, move to, or threaten everything up to 100 meters. They would be second circle. Third circle would be everything in a kilometer. Fourth is everything in 10 kilometers.
And Marcus is part of a fourth circle order? I asked the question. But the expression on that freckled face told me I was wrong.
Seventh.
She giggled nervously.
It isn't a direct measure of power, but it is a useful proxy. Lucky that much of that ranking is tied up in the speeds that those tonsured to Albrecht get. Still, to even hit the speeds that he can requires him to be so utterly invulnerable that it's not that much of a consolation. Still, I hope he doesn't have enough weight to stand up to me.
Do you have a plan? Ezra shook her head.
Plans this early are a bad idea. I have a couple of approaches that I hope to use, but there isn't enough information on the board to plan out anything.
Her tongue darted out nervously, and those tiny rosebud lips glistened.
I need to meet them. Suss out their defenses. Once I have them pegged, then I can start formulating a real strategy of attack.
How do you plan on doing that? The question was sincere, but some damnable part of me couldn't help but poison the word plan with an acrid edge.
Very cute.
Ezra smirked.
Suffice to say, I will not be spending my time following you around waiting with bated breath to determine guilt or innocence. When you manage to blunder your way to some conclusion or another, I will be standing ready to drop the axe.
There was a twinge of pain in my hand, and I turned to see the android's clipping last suture and stepping back. I was stunned. That was fast even by surgical standards. Yes, there had been 2 of them, and yes, they had 6 arms each, but given the damage, I would have expected it to take an hour at least to properly reduce, repair, and set the extremity. Slowly, sensation was returning as they disengaged the nerve blocks. It hurt. Not as much as it should have, all things considered, but it ached. A bone-deep throb that beat in time with my heart. Languid pulses of discomfort. Why didn't they send the justicers? I found myself asking the question that had been simmering in the back of my mind. It hadn't consciously registered, but some part of me had been wondering why I was getting some unknown quantity rather than a trained team of monastic hunting paladins. Ezra seemed taken aback by the question. A disquieting shadow blanched over that tiny girl's face as she seemed to reorient herself. Frankly, I was surprised myself at the question. It had kinda slipped out while I was distracted by my hand. In response, her face creased in what looked like worry.
I think this is too public setting for that sort of talk. No?
There was a slight uncertainty in her tone, and I immediately took the hint. I nodded. Too public for sure. Ezra smiled like the devil herself and stepped in towards me like a striking snake.
Do you want the party line or a truth?
She whispered the words in my ear. My short hair stood on end, and I felt the soul deep thrum as the monk's halo unfolded over me. We were truly alone now. No creation in the universe could overhear us, and it mattered not that the Shivas were sitting at their ease a mere meter away. They might as well have been across the galaxy. The shining light of the awakened soul drew a boundary that sunk us out of objective reality into a slippery place between worlds. Her breath was hot on my ear, and I could feel her lips move as she spoke a question.
Well,
Oth, I stuttered. Too much was happening at once. Too many weird hormones and mixed signals. To stand inside a manifest halo was an embrace more intimate than sex. Had she wished, she could twist my mortal shape to her whims, reshape my reality with a thought. Instead, she stood there, leaning inside my defenses with her smiling lips a millimeter from my ear, holding my existence in her hands, all while smelling of lilac and rosewood.
officially, it's none of your business who the abbots chose to execute their will.
Her voice was no longer squeaky. It had sunk into a breathy contralto.
Unofficially, I need to destroy one of my peers to complete myself.
She chuckled, and the vibration sent tiny jolts through my head that traveled down my neck and made my heart jump. Her hunger was palpable, and through the connection between our souls, I felt it in my belly.
I have toiled for this right, and once you have found your killer, I will legally rip them to pieces and devour their soul.